Farmer Nibbin had seen a lot in his 70-odd years. He'd seen sheep stuck in places sheep had no business being, cabbages grow to alarming sizes, and once, a cow that could whistle. But nothing, not even the cow, had prepared him for the glowing silver craft that landed with a soft whump in his west field. The cows had scattered, the chickens had fainted, and Herbert, his prize bull, stood stock-still, staring at the strange object as though it owed him money. Nibbin, who was halfway through his afternoon cup of tea, placed the mug carefully on the fence post and squinted at the craft. "Well, that's new," he muttered, adjusting his cap. The thing was shiny, round, and hummed softly, like a kettle just about to boil. Before Nibbin could decide whether to poke it with his stick or run for the hills, a hatch slid open with a hiss, and out stepped a figure so otherworldly that even Herbert let out a low, confused moo. She was tall, with long, shimmering limbs that seemed to catch the sunlight and toss it back in a way that made her look like she was carved from moonlight itself. Her hair, if it could be called hair, flowed like liquid silver, and her eyes were enormous, the kind of eyes you could drown in if you weren't careful. She moved with a grace that made even the best-dressed sheepdog look clumsy, and when she spoke, her voice was like music, soft, lilting, and completely incomprehensible. "Blip Zarna," she said, or something to that effect. Nibbin blinked. "Pardon?" The figure tilted her head, then tried again. "Ne Korfa." "Right," said Nibbin, because it seemed like the polite thing to say. By now, a small crowd had gathered at the edge of the field, drawn by the glow and the increasingly agitated mooing of Herbert. Among them was Mayor Quimbley, who fancied himself a man of action, or at least a man who could look like one in a crisis. He adjusted his waistcoat, cleared his throat, and stepped forward. "Greetings, visitor," he called, his voice trembling just slightly. "On behalf of the good people of Wumplewick, welcome to Earth." The figure turned her large, luminous eyes toward him, and for a moment, Quimbley looked like he might faint. But then she raised her hands in what could only be described as a universal gesture of peace and said, "Blorp." "Well," said Quimbley, looking immensely pleased with himself, "I think we're off to a good start." The villagers nodded and murmured in agreement, though none of them had the faintest idea what was going on. Things might have ended there. Polite nods, a few cups of tea, and everyone agreeing not to mention the incident again, if not for old Bert. Bert was the sort of man who could take any situation and turn it into a source of profound discomfort for everyone involved. He had a knack for asking questions no one wanted to answer and making observations no one wanted to hear. As the crowd marveled at the strange visitor, Bert leaned toward his neighbor and muttered, "D'you think she knows about the important bit?" "What important bit?" the neighbor hissed back. Bert gave him a significant look. "Reproduction, mate. Can't have a proper first contact without explaining that, can we?" The neighbor, who had no interest in discussing reproduction with anyone, let alone an alien, looked horrified. But Bert's mutterings had already reached the ears of Quimbley, who turned pale and then, inexplicably, resolute. "Yes," he said, as though addressing an invisible audience. "Yes, that is important. She should understand." "What?" said several people at once. "Reproduction," Quimbley declared, puffing out his chest. "It's the cornerstone of life, isn't it? We have a duty to share our knowledge." Nibbin, who had been hoping this would all blow over so he could get back to his tea, groaned. "You can't be serious." Quimbley, but it was too late. The mayor had taken it upon himself to educate the visitor, and the crowd, sensing this would be at least mildly entertaining, began to murmur in approval. "Someone fetch Dr. Mimples," Quimbley ordered. "He'll know what to do." Dr. Mimple, who had spent the past 20 years tending to Wumplewick's various aches, pains, and mysterious rashes, was not thrilled to be summoned. Still, he arrived with his trusty black bag and a look of grim determination, ready to tackle whatever nonsense the villagers had cooked up this time. When Quimbley explained the situation, Mimple's eyebrows disappeared into his hairline. "You want me to what?" "Explain reproduction, Quimbley said firmly. To an alien? Yes. And how, pray tell? Do you expect me to do that? Use diagrams, Quimbley suggested. And so, against his better judgment, Dr. Mimple found himself standing in the village barn, facing the alien, who had since been dubbed Lem for convenience, with a large sketchpad and a crowd of eager onlookers. Right, Mimple began, flipping to a page that vaguely resembled a human anatomy diagram. This is, a human. Lem tilted her head, her luminous eyes narrowing slightly. And this, Mimple continued, pointing to a particularly questionable part of the drawing, is the reproductive organ. The barn fell silent. What does it do? Lem asked, her voice as calm as ever. Well, Mimple hesitated. It's for reproduction. And what is that? It's how we, make more humans. Lem's eyes widened. You grow them? Sort of. And this organ, it is required. Yes. There was a long pause, during which Lem appeared to be processing this information. Then, with the kind of unflinching logic that only an outsider could muster, she said, Show me. Mimple blinked. I beg your pardon? You said it is important, Lem said, her tone as serene as a summer breeze. I wish to understand. Show me how it works. The crowd erupted into a mixture of gasps, laughter, and horrified whispers. Not like that, Mimple spluttered, his face turning a shade of red previously unseen in Wumpewik. Good heavens, no. Quimbley, sensing things were spiraling out of control, stepped in. Perhaps a, demonstration with an object might suffice? And that was how Sheriff Podge ended up sitting across from Lem, holding a turnip. It's symbolic, Podge explained, though it was clear he had no idea what he was talking about. Lem regarded the turnip with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. It is shaped like this. Not exactly, Podge admitted. Then why use it? Because, Podge said, now visibly sweating, it's close enough? The barn erupted into chaos once again. Suggestions were shouted, arguments broke out, and someone tried to explain the concept of metaphors, which only made things worse. Through it all, Lem sat patiently, holding the turnip and looking increasingly bewildered. Finally, Nibbin, who had had quite enough of this nonsense, stood up. Right, that's it. This is ridiculous. Just tell her it's complicated and leave it at that. The crowd grumbled but began to disperse, leaving Lem alone with her turnip and the weight of humanity's collective awkwardness. Later that evening, Lem sat on the hill overlooking the village, the turnip resting beside her. Sheriff Podge joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea. Sorry about all that, he said, handing her a cup. Lem sipped cautiously. Your species is unusual. Yeah, Podge agreed. We're a bit of a mess. Lem smiled faintly. Perhaps, but you are also endearing. Podge chuckled. That's one way to put it. The days following the Great Turnip Incident, as it came to be known, were oddly quiet in Wumpewik. Lem had settled into a sort of routine, one that involved frequent strolls through the village, long conversations with Sheriff Podge, and the occasional bewildered observation of human behavior. It was clear to everyone that Lem was not just passing through. Her craft remained firmly parked in Nibbin's west field, its glowing surface reflecting the sunset each evening. The villagers, having mostly recovered from their initial excitement, began to treat her presence with a mix of curiosity and cautious acceptance. She's not so bad, really, Old Bert admitted one morning over his second pint at the pub. Bit odd, but who isn't? Odd? She's an alien, exclaimed Millie the barmaid, as she wiped down the counter. I'd say odd is putting it lightly. Well, she doesn't complain about the ale, does she? Bert countered. Probably because she doesn't drink it, Millie shot back. Bert shrugged. All the same, I reckon she's no trouble. Not like them tourists from the city. Meanwhile, Lem continued her observations, jotting down notes in a peculiar, shimmering notebook that seemed to write itself as she moved her fingers over it. She was fascinated by human life, particularly their rituals. The concept of sharing tea, for example, baffled her. It wasn't just a liquid. It was the way people gathered, the way they used it as an excuse to talk, to bond, to argue about things like the correct steeping time. Sheriff Podge, who had taken it upon himself to act as Lem's unofficial guide, often found himself struggling to explain the nuances of human behavior. "Why do you do this?" Lem asked one afternoon, gesturing to the group of women hanging freshly washed linens on a line in the village square. "Laundry?" Podge replied, "Well, because we need clean clothes." Lem tilted her head. "But why do you do it together?" "It's just how it's done," Podge said, scratching his head. "Makes it go faster, I suppose. And people like to talk while they work." "Talking is efficient, then?" Podge chuckled. "Not always. Sometimes it's just nice." Lem nodded, though her expression suggested she was filing the information away for later analysis. As the weeks went on, Lem's presence began to feel almost normal, at least by Wumplewick standards. She helped Farmer Nibbin mend a fence, much to Herbert the Bull's annoyance. She spent hours at the schoolhouse, watching the children learn their letters and numbers. And once, to everyone's astonishment, she joined the village choir, her voice blending so beautifully with the others that even the notoriously grumpy organist was moved to tears. But despite her growing integration into village life, Lem couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she wasn't truly understood. The turnip incident had been her first clue that humans were as bewildered by her as she was by them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the air filled with the scent of hay and wood smoke, Lem sat with Podge on the same hill overlooking the village. "I have been thinking," she said, her voice soft. "Dangerous business, that," Podge replied with a grin. Lem ignored the joke. "Your species places great importance on understanding. And yet, when faced with the unknown, you often respond with confusion. Or fear." Podge nodded. "That's fair. We're not great with new things. Takes us a while to get our heads around them. Do you fear me?" Podge looked at her, surprised. "No, I don't think anyone here does. And yet, you do not understand me." "Well, no," Podge admitted, "but I reckon that's all right. We don't have to understand everything straight away. Sometimes it's enough just to get along." Lem considered this, her luminous eyes reflecting the fading light. "Perhaps, but I wish to learn more about your kind. Truly learn." Podge smiled. "Then you're already one of us, Lem. Wanting to understand, well, that's about as human as it gets." Lem returned his smile, though there was a wistfulness in her expression that Podge couldn't quite place. Unbeknownst to either of them, events were brewing in the wider world. Word of the silver craft in Wumplewick had begun to spread, reaching the ears of people far less inclined toward acceptance than the villagers. One such person was Edwin J. Fluffington III, the self-proclaimed alien expert who hosted a late-night radio show called Cosmic Conspiracies. From his studio in London, he spun tales of government cover-ups, alien abductions, and the secret lizard overlords controlling the weather. When a caller mentioned a strange being living in a tiny village in the countryside, Fluffington's eyes lit up with the kind of manic excitement usually reserved for finding a 20-pound note in an old coat pocket. "We must investigate," he declared, pounding his desk for emphasis, "for the truth shall not hide from Fluffington." Within days, a convoy of vans plastered with garish slogans, "Aliens are among us, and the truth is out there, but mostly here," arrived in Wumplewick, bringing with them cameras, microphones, and an alarming number of tinfoil hats. The villagers, who had just begun to enjoy the quiet rhythm of life with Lem, were none too pleased. "What do they want?" Millie demanded, watching the newcomers set up camp in the village square. "Publicity," muttered Nibbin, who had taken to carrying a pitchfork everywhere just in case. Lem, for her part, seemed more curious than concerned. "Are these normal humans?" she asked Podge. "Not exactly," Podge admitted. "They're the sort who see a shadow and think it's a monster. Best to steer clear. But steering clear proved impossible when Fluffin himself marched up to Lem, brandishing a microphone like a weapon. "Madam Alien," he began, his voice dripping with melodrama. "What do you say to the accusations that you are here to conquer Earth?" Lem blinked. "I am here to study laundry." Fluffin looked momentarily thrown, but quickly recovered. "Ah, a cunning ruse. But we know the truth. You seek to infiltrate our society, and—" "That's enough," Podge interrupted, stepping between Lem and the self-proclaimed expert. "She's done nothing wrong. Leave her be." But Fluffin was not so easily deterred. "The people have a right to know. They have a right to be left alone," Podge shot back. The standoff might have escalated further if not for Herbert the Bull, who chose that moment to make his displeasure known by charging through the square, scattering reporters and knocking over a camera. As chaos erupted, Lem turned to Podge, her serene demeanor unshaken. "Your species is resilient." Podge laughed despite himself. "That's one way to put it." And as the sun set over Wumplewick, the villagers rallied together to protect their newfound friend, proving that while humanity might be messy, awkward, and prone to misunderstanding, it was also fiercely loyal to those it called its own. The chaos Fluffin and his entourage brought to Wumplewick didn't vanish overnight, though the villagers tried their best to hasten the process. The sight of Farmer Nibbin shaking a pitchfork at anyone who dared trespass on his fields became a common occurrence. Millie started handing out tea in cups that were suspiciously chipped, possibly to encourage the visitors to leave faster. Sheriff Podge, however, bore the brunt of the intrusion. His days became a tangled mess of diffusing arguments, escorting overly curious reporters out of private gardens, and occasionally standing between Lem and Flufferton, whose theories only grew wilder by the day. "Do you feel remorse for invading our planet?" Flufferton demanded one morning, shoving his microphone under Lem's nose. "I did not invade," Lem replied evenly. "Your gravity intercepted my trajectory. I was merely passing by." Flufferton's eyes gleamed as if she'd confirmed his suspicions. "So, you admit to being here against your will, a prisoner of Earth's gravity." "I suppose that is accurate," Lem said thoughtfully, though her tone lacked the drama Flufferton clearly craved. "And yet," Flufferton continued, turning to his cameraman, "she remains here, watching, observing, preparing. She's helping Mrs. Trindle fix her barn roof," Podge interrupted dryly, appearing behind Flufferton with a firm grip on his shoulder. "Now, how about you observe the village boundary instead?" Flufferton scowled but allowed himself to be guided away, muttering something about small minds failing to grasp cosmic significance. Lem, meanwhile, continued her peculiar integration into village life. The barn repair turned into a full-fledged construction project as she introduced Mrs. Trindle to alien adhesives that rendered nails entirely obsolete. The school children adored her, especially after she built a floating globe that turned geography lessons into something resembling a magic show. Yet, despite these moments of connection, Lem often found herself puzzling over the intricacies of human behavior. For instance, the sheer variety of greetings baffled her. In her own culture, a simple exchange of light orbs sufficed for all occasions, but humans waved, nodded, shook hands, hugged, and sometimes engaged in an awkward maneuver Podge called the cheek kiss. Lem tried to document these variations, but every time she thought she understood the rules, a new exception presented itself. Then there was the matter of food. Lem could consume human sustenance without difficulty, but the emotional weight humans attached to meals intrigued her. A simple pie could be comforting, a sandwich unsatisfactory, and tea disastrous if the milk-to-water ratio wasn't precisely right. One evening, as Podge joined her for a meal outside her ship, she brought up her observations. "Why does food matter so much to your kind?" she asked, holding up a slice of bread as though it might reveal its secrets. Podge chewed thoughtfully before answering. "It's not just about eating. Food brings people together. It's how we show we care, or celebrate, or sometimes argue." "Argue?" Ever seen two villagers debate the best way to bake a scone? Lem considered this. So, food is a social lubricant. Podge snorted. Never heard it put like that, but yeah, I guess so. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the village square. Shouts echoed through the evening air, and Podge instinctively reached for his hat. "What now?" he muttered, rising to his feet. Lem followed, curious as ever. They found a crowd gathered near the pub, where Fluffington stood on a makeshift stage constructed from overturned crates. "Ladies and gentlemen," he bellowed, "I present to you irrefutable evidence of extraterrestrial intent." He held aloft a peculiar device that gleamed under the lantern light. "That's my egg whisk," Millie deadpanned from the crowd. Fluffington faltered but quickly recovered. "Aha! An alien egg whisk, clearly stolen to conceal its true purpose." Millie folded her arms. "You nicked that from my kitchen this morning, you daft plonker." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Fluffington's smug expression wavered. "Is this true?" Podge demanded, stepping forward. "It's research," Fluffington protested, "for the good of humanity." "Research or not," Podge said, "you don't steal from a villager." The crowd nodded, and Fluffington looked increasingly cornered. Lem, observing from the edge, decided it was time to intervene. She stepped forward, her serene presence silencing the crowd. "This object," she said, gesturing to the whisk, "is indeed a tool of great importance. It ensures the uniform dispersion of matter within a vessel, a principle valued by both my kind and yours." Fluffington beamed, taking this as vindication, but Lem wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "its purpose here is clear: to create nourishment, to foster community. That it was taken without permission disrupts that purpose. A grave misuse by any standard." The crowd erupted into laughter, and Fluffington's face turned a shade that rivaled Mrs. Trindle's prize tomatoes. Podge stepped in, confiscating the whisk and ushering Fluffington off the stage. As the villagers dispersed, Lem turned to Podge. "Did I handle that correctly?" "Perfectly," Podge said with a grin. But even as the village returned to its usual rhythm, the encounter left Lem pondering humanity's contradictions. They were capable of pettiness and kindness, chaos and order, suspicion and trust. And though she still had much to learn, one thing became increasingly clear. She wasn't just studying humanity. She was becoming part of it. The weeks turned into months, and life in Wumplewick settled into a peculiar harmony. Lem, once a curious and cautious visitor, had become a fixture of village life. Her presence was no longer met with wide-eyed stares, but warm smiles and the occasional wave. Fluffington and his entourage, despite their initial disruptions, had left. Their grand exposé never materialized, thanks in large part to Lem's calm demeanor and the villagers' steadfast refusal to be part of a cosmic conspiracy. Podge, ever pragmatic, had escorted the journalist to the train station with a final warning. "Don't let me catch you trying to steal another whisk." But for Lem, the most profound changes were not in the village but within herself. The human concepts of community, trust, and care had reshaped her understanding of connection. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of gold and purple, Lem stood at the edge of her ship. Podge approached, his hat in hand, an unusual look of uncertainty on his face. "Leaving?" he asked, though the answer was clear. Lem nodded. "My people have received my signals. They wish to know what I have learned." "And what will you tell them?" he asked, his tone softer than usual. Lem considered her words carefully. "I will tell them that humanity is a contradiction, that you are both flawed and extraordinary, and that your greatest strength lies not in your technology or power, but in your ability to create bonds, to care for one another, even in your imperfections." Podge chuckled, his gaze fixed on the ground. "That's a kinder assessment than we probably deserve." "Perhaps," Lem said, tilting her head, "but it is true." A silence fell between them, comfortable yet heavy with the knowledge of parting. Lem broke it first. "You have been my greatest teacher," she said. Your patience and wisdom have shown me more than I could have learned alone. Pod shifted, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. Well, someone had to keep you out of trouble. She smiled. And you did. Most of the time. A distant hum filled the air as Lem's ship began to awaken. The villagers gathered in the square, watching with a mix of awe and melancholy. Mrs. Trindle wiped a tear from her cheek, while Millie handed out tea in mugs that were suspiciously intact this time. As the ship's lights grew brighter, Lem stepped forward to address the crowd. "You have given me more than I can express," she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "I hope, in my way, I have given something back." Millie piped up. "You've definitely given us a new barn roof that'll outlive us all." The crowd laughed, the sound warm and genuine. Podge stepped closer to Lem, his hand outstretched. She hesitated for a moment, then took it, understanding the gesture now. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "And you," she replied. With a final glance at the village, Lem ascended into her ship. The hum grew louder, the vessel lifting gracefully into the sky. The villagers watched until it became a mere speck, then vanished entirely. For a moment, silence reigned in Wumplewick. Then Millie clapped her hands together. "Well, that was a spectacle," she said. "Now, who's going to help me with the washing-ups?" Life in the village resumed, though it was undeniably changed. Lem's time among them became a story, one told around fires and in pubs, passed down to new generations. And though the villagers would never see her again, they felt her presence in every act of kindness, every moment of connection. As for Lem, she carried Wumplewick with her, a piece of humanity etched into her very being. Her report to her people spoke not just of humans, but of their capacity for growth, for understanding, and for something far greater than she had ever anticipated, belonging. In the end, it wasn't just Lem who had learned from the humans. It was the humans who had grown, too, simply by knowing her.